The airport bustled with activity as people rushed to catch their flights. Among them was Linda Brooks, a woman in her mid-40s with carefully styled blonde hair and designer clothes that screamed success. She walked with purpose, rolling her expensive luggage behind her, occasionally checking her watch as if her time was more valuable than everyone else's. Linda had just wrapped up a big marketing deal in Atlanta and was heading back to Chicago. After breezing through security with her priority pass, she treated herself to an overpriced coffee and a gossip magazine before heading to her gate. Now boarding Group Aid for Flight 2187 to Chicago, the announcement came over the speaker. Linda gathered her things, straightened her blouse, and walked toward the gate with confidence. She handed her boarding pass to the attendant with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Walking down the narrow airplane aisle, Linda counted the rows until she reached her window seat in row 14. As she approached, her smile faded. A small black boy, probably around 8 years old, sat in the middle seat next to hers. He wore a neat button-up shirt and was completely absorbed in a book about space, his little fingers tracing the pictures of planets and stars. Linda stood there for a moment, her lips pressing into a thin line. She looked around quickly, checking if there were any other open seats on the plane. The flight seemed packed. People continued boarding, filling in every available spot. "Excuse me," she said loudly, trying to catch the attention of a flight attendant who was helping another passenger stow their luggage. When the young woman in the blue uniform looked her way, Linda beckoned her over with an impatient wave. "Is there a problem, ma'am?" The flight attendant asked politely, though her eyes showed she was already tired despite the early hour of the day. Linda lowered her voice, but not enough that people nearby couldn't hear. "I was wondering if I could be moved to a different seat, perhaps in business class. I'd be willing to pay the difference." The flight attendant glanced at the boy, who was still reading his book, seemingly unaware of the conversation happening above him. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but the flight is completely full today. We don't have any open seats available." "But surely there must be something you can do," Linda insisted, her voice carrying a hint of entitlement. "I'm a frequent flyer with your airline." The flight attendant's professional smile remained fixed, but her eyes hardened slightly. "I understand, ma'am, but as I mentioned, we have a full flight today. I'm afraid you'll need to take your assigned seat." A few passengers nearby had stopped their conversations to watch the scene unfold. An older woman a few rows ahead shook her head in disapproval. Linda realized people were staring. With a huff, she stored her carry-on in the overhead bin and reluctantly took her seat beside the boy. She made a show of arranging herself as far away from him as the narrow airplane seat would allow, practically pressing herself against the window. The boy finally looked up from his book and offered a shy smile. "Hello," he said with a small wave. "My name's Thomas." Linda gave him a tight-lipped nod, but didn't introduce herself in return. Instead, she pulled out her phone and pretended to be deeply engaged in checking her emails. Thomas waited for a response for a few seconds before his smile slowly faded. He returned to his book, occasionally stealing glances at the unfriendly woman beside him. The middle-aged man who took the aisle seat gave Thomas a warm smile as he sat down. "That's a cool book you've got there. You like space?" Thomas's face lit up. "Yes, I'm going to a special science camp in Chicago. I know all the planets and lots of stars too." Linda pulled out her noise-canceling headphones and put them on without turning on any music, creating a barrier between herself and the enthusiastic conversation happening beside her. As the plane prepared for takeoff, she stared out the window, refusing to acknowledge the child next to her, unaware that this flight would change her life forever. The plane climbed into the sky, leaving Atlanta behind. Linda kept her headphones on, though no music played through them. She scrolled mindlessly through her phone until the flight attendant announced all electronics needed to be put away during takeoff. With a sigh, she tucked her phone into her purse and stared out the window at the shrinking city below. Thomas had put his spacebook down on his lap during takeoff, his small hands gripping the armrests tightly. Once the plane leveled out, he returned to his reading, occasionally looking at Linda as if trying to decide whether to try speaking to her again. Finally, the boy gathered his courage. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a colorful picture of Saturn in his book. "Did you know Saturn's rings are made of ice and rock? And it has 82 moons." Linda glanced at the book briefly, then turned away. Interesting, she said flatly, not bothering to remove her headphones. Thomas tried again. I'm going to a special science camp in Chicago. Only 20 kids from the whole country got picked. My teacher helped me apply. Linda nodded without looking at him, then pretended to adjust her headphones as if they were playing something fascinating. She pulled out the in-flight magazine and began flipping through it. The man in the aisle seat noticed the exchange and leaned over. That's really impressive, buddy. You must be really smart. Thomas smiled shyly. I like learning about space and robots. I built a robot that can sort colors for my science fair. Wow, that's incredible, the man said with genuine enthusiasm. Linda shifted uncomfortably in her seat, trying to ignore the conversation happening beside her. She raised her hand to call over a flight attendant. Could I get a glass of white wine, please? She asked when the attendant arrived. It was barely past noon, but Linda felt she needed something to make this flight more bearable. As the attendant left to fetch her drink, Thomas looked at Linda with curious eyes. My name is Thomas. What's yours? He asked again, still hoping for a proper introduction. Linda hesitated, then answered curtly, Linda. She immediately returned to her magazine, flipping pages without really reading them. That's a nice name, Thomas said politely. My teacher at school is named Ms. Linda too. Linda gave a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes and continued to ignore him. The flight attendant returned with Linda's wine and placed it on her tray table. She then turned to Thomas with a much warmer smile. Would you like some apple juice or a snack, young man? Thomas's face lit up. Yes, please. Apple juice would be great. Coming right up, the attendant said, giving Linda a slightly disapproving glance before walking away. Linda sipped her wine, feeling the judging eyes of passengers around her. An elderly couple across the aisle whispered to each other while looking in her direction. The man sitting next to Thomas had pulled out a book but kept glancing at Linda with a frown. Thomas seemed unfazed by Linda's coldness. He returned to his spacebook, quietly reading facts to himself in a whisper. Neptune is the windiest planet. Winds can reach 1,200 miles per hour. Despite herself, Linda found her ears picking up some of these facts. She had never been particularly interested in astronomy, but some of the information was admittedly fascinating. Still, she maintained her distance, both physically and emotionally. When the flight attendant brought Thomas his apple juice, she also slipped him a package of cookies. A special treat for our special passenger headed to science camp, she said with a wink. Thank you. Thomas beamed, carefully opening the package so as not to make a mess. He politely offered one to Linda. Would you like a cookie? They're really good. Linda glanced at the cookie, then at Thomas's hopeful expression. Something in his innocent, kind eyes made her pause. Reluctantly, she removed one headphone. No, thank you. You enjoy them, she said, her voice slightly less cold than before. For the next half hour, Linda continued pretending to read her magazine while Thomas quietly enjoyed his snack and returned to his book. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as they flew through a patch of clouds, casting a gray shadow over the passengers. Outside, the sky began to darken as they flew toward a band of storms ahead, completely unaware of the turbulence that was about to change everything. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, interrupting the quiet hum of the airplane. Folks, this is your captain speaking. We're heading into some rough weather ahead. I've turned on the fasten seatbelt sign. Please return to your seats and make sure your seatbelts are securely fastened. Linda glanced out the window. Dark clouds had gathered outside, turning the once blue sky into a threatening gray mass. She tightened her seatbelt, gripping her armrest with one hand while finishing the last sip of her wine with the other. Thomas looked up from his book, his eyes widening as he noticed the change in the sky. He carefully closed his book and tucked it into the seat pocket in front of him, then double-checked his seatbelt. Have you ever been in turbulence before? The man in the aisle seat asked Thomas kindly. Once, when I flew to visit my grandma, Thomas replied, his voice steady despite the hint of nervousness in his eyes. It wasn't too bad. The flight attendants rushed down the aisle, checking seatbelts and storing loose items. They barely made it back to their seats when the first jolt hit, causing the plane to drop suddenly. Several passengers gasped. Someone toward the back let out a small scream. The plane steadied for a moment, then shook violently as it entered the heart of the storm. Thomas's small body tensed. His hands gripped the armrests so tightly that his knuckles turned pale. Linda, still determined to maintain her distance, pressed herself closer to the window, watching raindrops begin to lash against the glass. The plane dropped again, more severely this time. Drinks that hadn't been collected spilled. A few overhead bins popped open, and a flight attendant's voice came over the intercom, urging everyone to remain calm and seated. That's when it happened. A massive air pocket caught the plane, causing it to plummet for what felt like forever, but was really only seconds. The sensation of weightlessness gripped every passenger. Oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling in some rows, dangling and swinging with the movement of the aircraft. Without thinking, Thomas grabbed Linda's arm, his small fingers digging into her sleeve as terror overtook him. His eyes were squeezed shut, and a small whimper escaped his lips. Linda's first instinct was to pull away. Her body stiffened, and she looked down at the small hand clutching her arm. But something stopped her. Perhaps it was the genuine fear on the boy's face, or the way his whole body trembled. In that moment, she didn't see a black child she wanted to avoid. She saw only a frightened young boy, alone and scared. "It's okay," she heard herself say, surprising even herself with the gentleness in her voice. "This is normal. The plane is built to handle this." Thomas's eyes opened, looking up at her with a mix of fear and hope. The plane continued to shake, rattling the seats and causing the overhead reading lights to flicker. "The turbulence is just like driving on a bumpy road," Linda explained, finding herself placing her free hand over his. "The pilots know exactly what to do." "It feels like we're falling," Thomas whispered, his grip still tight on her arm. Linda nodded. "I know it does, but we're not really falling. It just feels that way because of air pockets. They're like potholes in the sky. The plane drops a little bit when it hits one, but then it stabilizes." As if on cue, the plane steadied slightly, though it continued to shake. Thomas's grip loosened just a fraction, but he didn't let go completely. "I fly a lot for work," Linda continued, surprising herself with each word of comfort she offered. "I've been through turbulence dozens of times. It's scary, but it's not dangerous." The man in the aisle seat, who had been gripping his own armrests tightly, gave Linda an appreciative nod. "How long will it last?" Thomas asked, his voice steadier now despite the continued shaking of the plane. "Usually not long. We'll be through it soon," Linda said. "Try taking deep breaths. In through your nose, out through your mouth." Thomas nodded and followed her instructions, taking deliberate breaths. Linda found herself breathing in rhythm with him, a strange feeling of connection forming between them despite her earlier resolve to keep her distance. The captain's voice came over the intercom again. "We're working on finding a smoother altitude, folks. Should be out of this rough patch in about 10 minutes. Flight attendants will remain seated for now." As the plane continued to bounce through the storm clouds, Linda found herself telling Thomas about other flights she'd been on, times when the turbulence had been even worse, and how everything had turned out fine. With each story, his grip on her arm relaxed a little more, though he didn't let go completely. By the time the plane finally broke through the storm into smoother air, Thomas had calmed considerably. He slowly released Linda's arm, leaving behind small wrinkled marks on her silk blouse where his fingers had desperately held on. "Thank you," he said quietly, looking up at her with genuine gratitude. Linda straightened her blouse, an awkward silence falling between them as she realized how quickly her carefully constructed barrier had crumbled in the face of simple human fear. She cleared her throat, uncertain what to say now that the crisis had passed. "You're welcome," she finally managed, avoiding his eyes. But something has shifted, something significant that neither of them fully understood yet. The plane cruised at a steady altitude now, the violent shaking finally gone. Sunlight streamed through the windows as they flew above the storm clouds. The captain turned off the seatbelt sign with a cheerful ding, and a collective sigh of relief swept through the cabin. Flight attendants moved through the aisles, checking on passengers and cleaning up spilled drinks. One stopped beside their row, bending down to Thomas's eye level. "You okay, sweetie? That was some pretty rough air." Thomas nodded, his usual brightness slowly returning to his face. "I'm okay now. The lady helped me." He gestured toward Linda, who shifted uncomfortably under the flight attendant's surprised gaze. "Well, that was very nice," the attendant said, giving Linda an approving smile before moving on. An awkward silence settled between Linda and Thomas. She pulled out her phone, intending to create a barrier between them again, but found herself hesitating. Thomas had already reached for his space book, flipping through to find his place. "What's that book about, exactly?" Linda heard herself ask, the words coming out before she could stop them. Thomas looked up, surprise and delight spreading across his face. "It's all about space. Planets and stars and black holes and astronauts." He held up the book so she could see the cover. "Amazing Universe. Junior Astronomer's Guide." "I see," Linda said, not sure what else to add. But Thomas didn't need much encouragement. "This is my favorite part," he said, flipping to a page with a stunning photograph of Earth taken from space. "It shows how we're all living on this one blue planet together. My dad says that's why we should be kind to everyone, because we're all traveling through space on the same spaceship." Linda studied the image, struck by the simple wisdom in the boy's words. "Your dad sounds smart," she said quietly. "He is." Thomas beamed with pride. "He knows everything. He's the one who got me interested in science. He takes me to museums and buys me books and helps me with my experiments." Linda found herself genuinely curious. What kind of experiments? Thomas's eyes lit up at the question. "Last month we built a volcano with real bubbling lava. And before that, we made a robot that could follow a line on the floor. That's why I got picked for the science camp, because of my robot project." "That's impressive," Linda said, meaning it. "How old are you?" 8, Thomas replied, "but I'll be 9 next month." "And you built a robot at 8 years old." Linda couldn't hide her surprise. "Dad helped with the hard parts," Thomas admitted. "He knows a lot about electronics." The conversation flowed more easily now. Thomas told her about the science camp he was heading to in Chicago, a special 2-week program for gifted children interested in STEM fields. Only 20 kids from across the country had been selected. "My teacher, Mrs. Wilson, helped me apply. She said I had natural aptitude." Thomas pronounced the phrase carefully, clearly proud of it. "That means I'm good at science stuff." "I know what it means," Linda said with a small smile, her earlier coldness melting away. "And it sounds like Mrs. Wilson is right." As Thomas spoke about his dreams of becoming an astronaut or maybe an engineer like his father, Linda found herself drawn into his world. The enthusiasm in his voice was contagious, his knowledge impressive for someone so young. "Did you know that on Jupiter, the biggest storm has been raging for hundreds of years?" Thomas asked, pointing to a picture in his book. "It's called the Great Red Spot, and it's big enough to fit 3 Earths inside it." "I didn't know that," Linda admitted, leaning slightly closer to see the image. "And Saturn's rings are made of billions of pieces of ice and rock, some as tiny as dust, others as big as houses." The man in the aisle seat, who had been quietly listening to their conversation, chuckled. "You should be teaching astronomy classes, young man." Thomas grinned at the compliment. "I gave a presentation to my whole school about the planets. I got a special certificate for it." Linda found herself wondering about Thomas's home life. A father who encouraged his interests, teachers who recognized his potential, a special science camp that saw his promise. This boy was being raised with care and attention, his natural talents nurtured. She thought about her own rush to judgment when she first boarded the plane. How quickly she had made assumptions based solely on the color of his skin. A feeling of shame began to creep in around the edges of her consciousness. "Would you like to see my science fair pictures?" Thomas asked, pulling a small tablet from his backpack. "My dad loaded them on here so I could show people at camp." "Sure," Linda said, surprised by her own genuine interest. Thomas turned on the tablet and opened a photo album. The first picture showed him standing proudly next to a small robot made from what looked like recycled materials and electronic components. His smile was enormous, a gap where his front tooth should be making him look even younger. "That's my line-following robot," he explained. "It has sensors on the bottom that can detect the black line, and then it sends signals to the motors to keep following it." As Thomas swiped through more photos, explaining each project with the precision of a much older student, Linda felt something shift inside her. The barriers she had so carefully constructed were crumbling, replaced by something unexpected, respect, and maybe even a little bit of fondness for this bright, enthusiastic child who happened to be sitting next to her on this flight to Chicago. The captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing their descent into Chicago O'Hare International Airport. Linda was surprised by how quickly the remainder of the flight had passed. What had started as a dreaded 2-hour journey had transformed into an engaging conversation with the 8-year-old boy beside her. "We need to start packing up," Linda said, helping Thomas close his tablet and store it safely in his backpack. "Make sure you don't leave anything in the seat pocket." Thomas nodded and carefully tucked his space book into his bag. "I never forget my books. Dad says books are treasures." Linda smiled at that. "Your dad sounds like a wise man." "He is," Thomas agreed, zipping up his backpack. "He reads to me every night, even though I can read by myself now. He does all the funny voices for different characters." The plane tilted downward, beginning its final approach. Outside the window, the Chicago skyline came into view, skyscrapers stretching toward the clouds. Thomas pressed his face against the glass, taking in the sight with wide-eyed wonder. "Look at how tall they are," he exclaimed. "The Willis Tower is the tallest one. It used to be called the Sears Tower. It has 108 floors and 16,100 windows." Linda raised her eyebrows. "How do you know all these facts?" Thomas tapped his head. "I remember almost everything I read. Dad says I have a—" He paused, searching for the right term, "a phonographic memory." "Photographic," Linda gently corrected. "Right, photographic," Thomas repeated with a nod. "My brain takes pictures of what I read." The wheels of the plane touched down on the runway with a slight bump, and Thomas clapped his hands in excitement. "We're here." "I can't wait to see my dad and tell him about the turbulence." As the plane taxied to the gate, Linda found herself helping Thomas gather his things. She even tied his shoelace when she noticed it had come undone. The cold distance she had insisted upon at the beginning of the flight seemed like a distant memory now. When the seatbelt sign turned off, passengers began standing and reaching for their luggage from the overhead bins. The aisle quickly filled with people eager to deplane. Linda, noticing Thomas's small stature amid the crowd of adults, felt a sudden protectiveness. "Stay close," she told him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "It gets crowded, and I don't want you to get lost." Thomas nodded seriously. "Dad told me to be extra careful in airports because they're busy places." They waited for the crowd to thin before standing up. Linda retrieved her carry-on bag and then helped Thomas with his small suitcase. Together, they made their way down the narrow aisle toward the exit. "Thank you for flying with us today," the flight attendant said as they passed, giving Thomas a special wink. "I hope you have a wonderful time at science camp, young man." "Thank you." Thomas replied cheerfully. It was a good flight, except for the bumpy part. The flight attendant glanced at Linda with a knowing smile. Sometimes the bumpy parts lead to the best conversations. Linda felt her cheeks warm slightly as they continued into the jetway. The terminal buzzed with activity, people rushing to connecting flights, families reuniting, business travelers checking phones. Linda walked beside Thomas, unconsciously slowing her usual brisk pace to match his shorter steps. "My dad said he'd meet me right at the gate," Thomas explained, clutching the straps of his backpack tightly. "He got a special pass to come all the way to the gate since I'm traveling alone." Linda nodded. "Would you like me to wait with you until he arrives?" Thomas beamed up at her. "Yes, please. Then you can meet him. He's the coolest dad ever." As they emerged from the jetway into the terminal, Thomas suddenly stopped, his eyes scanning the waiting area. Linda watched as his face transformed, lighting up with pure joy. "Dad," he shouted, dropping his suitcase handle and breaking into a run. Linda followed his gaze and froze in place. Standing near the gate counter was a tall, imposing man in a military uniform adorned with medals and insignia that even Linda, with her limited knowledge of military rankings, recognized as significant. His posture was straight, his presence commanding attention from everyone nearby. Despite his formal appearance, his face broke into a warm, loving smile as he knelt down to catch Thomas in a tight embrace. Linda stood rooted to the spot, her mind racing. As the man stood up, lifting Thomas into his arms, she realized with a jolt that she recognized him. Not personally, but from television, from magazines, from news headlines. This was Lieutenant Colonel David Howard, a decorated war hero whose leadership had saved dozens of lives during a dangerous overseas mission just months ago. His face had been all over the media, his story told and retold as an example of exceptional courage and quick thinking under fire. She had watched an interview with him on a morning news show just last week. And he was Thomas's father. As Linda stood there, processing this revelation, Thomas spotted her and waved excitedly. "Dad, Dad. That's the nice lady from the plane I told you about. She helped me when it got bumpy." Colonel Howard set Thomas down and turned toward Linda, his eyes meeting hers. Linda felt a wave of shame wash over her as she remembered how she had treated his son just hours earlier, before the turbulence, before their conversation, before she had seen Thomas as a bright, exceptional child rather than just a black boy she didn't want to sit next to. Colonel Howard approached her, his hand extended and a genuine smile on his face. "Thank you for looking after my boy," he said, his voice deep and warm. "I'm David Howard, Thomas's dad." Linda's hand moved forward automatically to shake his, even as her mind raced with embarrassment and regret. "Linda Brooks," she managed to say, her voice sounding strangely distant to her own ears. It was no trouble at all. Thomas is a wonderful child." The words felt inadequate, almost hypocritical given her initial behavior, but they were true now, even if they hadn't been at the beginning of their journey together. Colonel Howard's handshake was firm, but not overwhelming, his smile genuine and warm. Linda felt her throat tighten with guilt as she looked into his kind eyes, so similar to his son's. "Thomas couldn't stop talking about you on the phone," Colonel Howard said. "He called me during his layover in Atlanta and mentioned he was sitting next to a marketing lady who didn't seem happy. Then he called again after boarding this flight and said you were helping him through the turbulence." Thomas tugged at his father's uniform sleeve. "Dad, she knows all about airplanes. She told me about air pockets and how the pilots know what to do. She wasn't scared at all." Linda felt her cheeks flush with heat. If only he knew how she had behaved at the beginning of the flight. She opened her mouth, unsure what to say, but Colonel Howard spoke first. "It sounds like you were exactly what Thomas needed at that moment. Thank you." His sincerity was unmistakable, making Linda feel even worse about her initial attitude. "It was nothing, really," she managed to say. He's a remarkable young man, very bright. He takes after his mother," Colonel Howard said with a hint of sadness in his smile. "She was a physics professor before." He paused, glancing down at Thomas, who was now examining one of the medals on his father's uniform. Linda understood immediately. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. Colonel Howard nodded his thanks for her understanding. "It's been 3 years now. Thomas and I are doing okay, aren't we, buddy?" Thomas looked up and smiled. "We're a team." A small group of people had gathered nearby, pointing and whispering. One man approached hesitantly, holding out a pen and what looked like an airport map. "Excuse me, sir," he said to Colonel Howard. "I don't mean to interrupt, but aren't you the officer from the Maroon Valley Rescue? Would you mind signing this for my son? He's in ROTC and has your picture pinned up in his dorm room." Colonel Howard handled the interruption with grace, signing the paper with a friendly word for the man's son. As soon as he finished, 2 more people approached, asking for photos and handshakes. Linda stood awkwardly to the side, watching as Thomas beamed with obvious pride in his father. The boy leaned close to her and whispered, "This happens all the time. Dad says it's important to be nice to everyone who comes up to him, even when we're busy." "That's very thoughtful of him," Linda replied, increasingly impressed by both father and son. After several minutes, Colonel Howard politely excused himself from the small crowd that had gathered. "I'm sorry, folks, but I need to spend some time with my son now. He's been traveling all day." He turned back to Linda. "We're staying at the airport hotel tonight. Thomas's camp doesn't start until tomorrow morning." He hesitated, then continued, "Would you like to join us for dinner? Thomas seems to have made a new friend, and I'd love to hear more about your conversation on the plane." Linda blinked in surprise, a mix of emotions washing over her. She didn't deserve this kindness after how she had initially treated Thomas. Yet here was an opportunity to make amends, to show them both the person she could be rather than the person who had boarded that plane in Atlanta. "I'd like that," she found herself saying. I'm actually staying at the airport hotel too. I have meetings in the city tomorrow. Perfect. Colonel Howard smiled. Thomas, is that okay with you? Would you like Ms. Brooks to join us for dinner? Yes, Thomas exclaimed, bouncing slightly on his toes. I can show her my collection of space mission patches. I brought them to show the other kids at camp. It's settled then, Colonel Howard said. We'll meet in the hotel restaurant at 6:30. That gives us all time to get settled and rested. Linda nodded, still somewhat stunned by the turn of events. Was she really going to have dinner with a national hero and his brilliant son? After the way she had behaved. As they walked together toward the baggage claim area, Thomas chattering happily between them, Linda noticed several people doing double takes as they passed. Some pointed, others nudged their companions. A few called out words of thanks to Colonel Howard, who acknowledged each with a humble nod or wave. Are you famous, Dad? Thomas asked, apparently noticing the attention for the first time. Colonel Howard chuckled. Not famous, buddy. I just did my job, and some people saw it on the news. Your father is being modest, Linda found herself saying. What he did was extraordinary. He saved many lives through his quick thinking and bravery. Thomas's eyes widened. You know about Dad's mission? Linda nodded. It was all over the news a few months ago. Your father is considered a hero by many people. My dad's always been my hero, Thomas said simply, reaching up to hold his father's hand. Colonel Howard looked down at his son with such love that Linda felt like an intruder witnessing something deeply personal. Yet she couldn't look away, moved by the bond between them. They reached the baggage claim area, where people were already gathering around the carousel, waiting for their luggage. Colonel Howard helped Thomas find a seat on a nearby bench, then turned to Linda. I should mention, he said in a lowered voice, that Thomas doesn't know all the details about what happened overseas. He knows I helped people, but not the dangerous parts. I'd appreciate it if we could keep it that way, at least until he's older. Of course, Linda replied, appreciating his trust in her. I understand completely. As they stood waiting for their bags, Linda caught her reflection in a nearby glass partition. The woman looking back at her seemed different somehow from the one who had boarded the plane in Atlanta just hours ago. Her face looked softer, her eyes more open. She wondered what Colonel Howard would think if he knew how she had initially treated his son, how she had asked to be moved to another seat rather than sit next to a black child. The shame of that moment contrasted sharply with the warmth she now felt for Thomas and the respect she had for his father. Linda made a silent promise to herself that she would never again judge someone so quickly, so superficially. The lesson had come at the cost of her own pride, but it was worth it. The hotel restaurant was nicer than Linda had expected, with warm lighting and tables spaced far enough apart for private conversation. She had changed from her travel clothes into a simple blue dress, taking extra care with her appearance. As she approached the entrance, she spotted Thomas and Colonel Howard already seated at a corner table. Thomas waved enthusiastically when he saw her. Ms. Brooks, we're over here. Linda made her way to their table, where Colonel Howard stood to greet her. Please call me David, he said, pulling out a chair for her. Then you must call me Linda, she replied, settling into her seat. Thomas had changed too, wearing a button-up shirt with tiny rocket ships printed on it. He had a small binder on the table that Linda guessed contained his collection of space mission patches. Dad said I could show you my patches after we order, Thomas explained, his fingers drumming excitedly on the binder. I have 23 different ones. I'm looking forward to seeing them, Linda said, genuinely meaning it. A waiter came to take their drink orders. A glass of wine for Linda, water for David, and apple juice for Thomas. As the waiter departed, David leaned forward slightly. So, Thomas tells me you work in marketing. What company are you with? Linda explained her role as marketing director for a healthcare company, surprised at how easy it was to talk with him. There was something about David's manner that put her at ease. A combination of confidence and humility that was rare in the executives she usually dealt with. Their conversation flowed naturally from work to life in general. David talked about raising Thomas as a single father, the challenges and joys it brought. How he had taken a teaching position at the military academy so he could have more stable hours for his son after his wife passed away. It hasn't always been easy, he admitted, watching as Thomas carefully arranged his napkin into an origami bird. But we've figured it out together, haven't we, buddy? Thomas nodded, focused on his creation. Dad learned to braid hair by watching YouTube videos, he said matter-of-factly, for my cousin Amy's wedding. David laughed. That was quite a learning curve. Amy's mom, my sister, was supposed to help get Thomas ready for the wedding, but she got stuck in traffic. There I was, a special forces officer defeated by a 5-year-old's hair. Linda found herself laughing too, charmed by the image of this decorated officer wrestling with hair braiding tutorials. As they ordered their meals and began to eat, Thomas proudly displayed his collection of space mission patches, explaining the significance of each one with impressive detail. This one is from Apollo 11, the first moon landing. And this one is from the International Space Station Expedition 42. Dad got it for my birthday. And this one, he continued, his enthusiasm never wavering. David watched his son with obvious pride. His mother would be so proud of him, he said quietly to Linda, while Thomas was distracted by the dessert menu. She always said he had a scientist's mind, even when he was just a toddler. He's remarkable, Linda agreed. You've done an amazing job with him. David shook his head slightly. I just try not to get in his way. Kids like Thomas, they come into the world with special gifts. Our job is to nurture those gifts, not reshape them. Linda thought about this wisdom, so different from her own upbringing, where conformity had been prized above all else. No wonder Thomas had such confidence and joy in his interests. As they finished their desserts, chocolate cake for Thomas, coffee for the adults, Linda felt a growing need to be honest. The weight of her earlier behavior had been sitting uncomfortably with her all evening. I need to tell you something, she said suddenly, setting down her coffee cup. When I first got on that plane today, she paused, searching for courage. I asked the flight attendant to move me to another seat, because I didn't want to sit next to Thomas. David's expression remained neutral, but his eyes studied her face carefully. I'm not proud of it, Linda continued. In fact, I'm deeply ashamed. I made a judgment based solely on. She glanced at Thomas, who was happily adding the last bits of chocolate frosting to his mouth, seemingly oblivious to the adult conversation. I understand, David said quietly. You don't need to say more. No, I do, Linda insisted. Because what happened afterward matters too. During that flight, Thomas changed something in me. His kindness, his brilliant mind, his enthusiasm, he broke through prejudices I didn't even realize I was carrying. She looked directly at David. I'm telling you this not to make myself feel better, but because I want you to know that your son did something important today. He changed someone for the better. David was silent for a moment, then reached over to wipe a smudge of chocolate from Thomas's cheek. Thomas has that effect on people, he finally said. His mother was the same way. They see the world with such open hearts that they teach the rest of us how to see better too. He met Linda's gaze again. We all have moments we're not proud of, Linda. What matters is what we do afterward. The fact that you're sitting here now, being honest about it, tells me everything I need to know. Thomas, finished with his dessert, looked between them curiously. Are you guys talking about grown-up stuff? Yes, buddy, just grown-up stuff, David said with a smile. Why don't you tell Linda about the experiment you want to do at science camp? As Thomas launched into an explanation of his planned experiment involving magnetism and electrical currents, Linda felt something release inside her. A knot of tension she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying. David's gracious acceptance of her confession had given her something precious, the chance to be better than her worst moment. Later that evening, as they said their goodbyes in the hotel lobby, Thomas gave Linda an unexpected hug. I'm glad you sat next to me on the plane, he said simply. So am I, Linda replied, meaning it with her whole heart. So am I. David shook her hand, holding it a moment longer than necessary. Thomas's camp ends in 2 weeks. We'll be back in Chicago overnight before flying home. Perhaps we could have dinner again. Linda's surprise must have shown on her face because David added, it's not often Thomas finds an adult who actually listens to him talk about space for hours. You made quite an impression. I'd like that very much, Linda said. As she watched them walk toward the elevators, Thomas's small hand in his father's larger one, Linda thought about the strange path that had led her here. how a flight she had dreaded had become the beginning of something unexpected and valuable. 3 years later, as Linda sat in the front row of Thomas's middle school science fair, watching him confidently explain his project on renewable energy to the judges, she would look back on that flight as the day her life changed course. Beside her sat David, now her husband, his hand warm in hers as they both beamed with pride at the boy who had brought them together, the boy who had taught a stranger on a plane that the hardest journey is often the one from judgment to understanding.